What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So Green Lanterns is the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth right now. God, this is such a great story because this is lost in time, right? But I would call it the return of Volthoom because it's basically him coming back in the form that people are so familiar with. Now, in terms of all the Volthoom stuff, we'll get through that as we get into this video. But one thing to keep in mind is that on the whole, Jessica Cruz and Simon Baz had never actually been trained as Green Lanterns. That's one of the reasons why the Green Lantern story is so cool, is because if you never read any of the classic stuff, if you never read Blackest Night, Brightest Day, Sinestro Corps War, any of that kind of stuff, you basically learn about the Green Lanterns as they learn about them. Now, what we covered up to this point to get you caught up is that for the most part, Jessica Cruz's history with Volthoom was initially ambiguous. All we knew was that the Crime Syndicate of America, basically an evil version of the Justice League from Earth 3, had invaded during the New 52 in a story called Forever Evil. And the idea was that the Crime Syndicate had their own Green Lantern. He went by the name Power Ring, but he basically possessed a lantern ring that was inhabited by the spirit of a being named Volthoom. Now, this ran and really kind of seemed to go side by side with an existing character named Volthoom, who was basically the first person to ever wield a lantern ring. The problem with this was that there was no reconciliation. We didn't really know if there was a relationship between those two characters. Now, as we found out in my videos, the first will and testament of Volthoom, of the first lantern, that the power ring as it existed and was possessed by the Volthoom entity was basically another aspect of the first lantern Volthoom himself. He had traveled in his efforts to try to save his own universe. He had come across different realities. Somebody took a piece of his essence, threw it into a ring on Earth 3, which was passed down the line until eventually it reached that reality's version of Hal Jordan, who invaded Earth during Forever Evil, and then once he was defeated, the ring sought out Jessica Cruz. So that was the whole idea with regards to her character's progression. Now, for the most part, Jessica Cruz has always dealt with a lack of confidence, the belief that she wasn't ever really a Green Lantern. It took her forever to be able to wield Green Lantern constructs. She wasn't really able to consistently be useful to Simon Baz as the two Green Lanterns on Earth. Now, as time progressed, that began to change as she grew more confident in herself. As she basically began moving away from fear dominating her life to tapping into her willpower, she was able to create these constructs. But again, despite the things these two characters have done, facing against the Red Lanterns, facing off against the Phantom Ring, we'll talk more about that as we get into this video, at the end of the day, they were never really trained as Green Lanterns. And so what ended up happening at the end of the last story is they were basically whisked away for training, essentially told you have to come to Mogo in order to be trained on how to use your rings. The problem with this is that for Simon Baz to a degree, and really more so for Jessica Cruz, she's never really left Earth. And that's kind of the big caveat to this. When she was the Green Lantern, she was fighting alongside the Justice League. She was doing all kinds of cool stuff, but it was always on Earth. It was always in a familiar setting. When she's out there floating around in the darkness of space, it's totally unfamiliar territory. Any number of things could happen that would result in her dying. I mean, it's really just the ring on her finger that keeps her alive. And that recognition really just kind of rings home in the idea that she's so overwhelmed. And so in the midst of her and Simon Baz really kind of being teleported away to Mogo, she really just kind of shouts, "Emergency, stop." Simon Baz keeps going, but she's just kind of left out in the middle of space. Now, of course, her inexperience with the ring is really highlighted here better than anything else, because for any Green Lantern, if they knew where their residence was supposed to be, if they knew where they were supposed to go, it would just say ring, chart a course for Mogo, and the ring would just take them to Mogo, and that would be the end of that. No muss, no fuss. But when you have no idea what it means to be a Green Lantern, when you have no idea where it is that you're going, you're basically thrust in this impossible situation. But fortunately for her, Kyle Rayner comes along. Now remember, Kyle Rayner, if you haven't been reading Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, Kyle Rayner basically lost his connection to the White Lanterns. That was a great big huge thing about his character. It was kind of like this soft reboot for Kyle Rayner. The indication and all signs pointed to the idea that Dr. Manhattan was the one that basically destroyed the White Lantern Corps. But regardless of who it was that had initiated the whole thing, the result is that Kyle Rayner went back to being a Green Lantern. Now, of course, the reason why he's here is to also help aid Jessica Cruz in understanding what it means to be a Green Lantern, because really, again, because she's been on Earth, she only knows the role insofar as being a superhero on Earth. But the Green Lantern's duties are never to just their home planet, it's to the entire sector. And so there are instances where Green Lanterns will just have to forego one planet in order to save another. That's just kind of the role they play. It's just the way the game gets done. And so because of that, Kyle Rayner really introduces her to this idea that as a Green Lantern, there's a massive amount of responsibility, but there's also a lot of gratitude if you play the role the way that you're supposed to. In this instance, he brings her to a planet of people who were attacked by some, crazy alien race or something along those lines. But Kyle Rayner had helped to basically nurture this race, helped to, restore them back to greatness. And in return, they were grateful for it. And so this is just another aspect to keep in mind with a Green Lantern, that yes, the universe is massive, which is why they're given sectors, but there's a lot more to take care of out there than just the planet Earth. Now, of course, this coincides in her arriving back to Mogo. And again, it's really Jessica Cruz getting a full eye view in terms of all these different lanterns that are out there, all the different races that exist, things like that. Because remember, the idea of encountering aliens is brand new to her. And so in the midst of all this, she's of course met with Kilowog, more or less the guy who used to be the drill instructor for the Green Lantern Corps. She's also introduced to what we already know in Hal Jordan of the Green Lantern Corps, that the Green Lanterns and the Sinestro Corps are basically working together, working in unison, since Sinestro is no longer part of the picture. But ultimately, they're both brought before Kilowog and everybody for the purpose of being trained. Now, the other half of this is the character of Rami. And Rami was newly introduced. He's part of DC Rebirth. But the idea was that Rami served as a way for writer Sam Humphries to begin the process of just kind of expanding on or completely revamping these origin stories, these classic events that went into the Green Lantern chronology, but were never fully fleshed out in the 10 years that Jeff Johns wrote the entire Green Lantern run that people hail as being one of the greatest comic runs ever. And so again, it allows these little small tidbits, these little itty bitty goodies to be kind of thrown into the story, and it really just kind of beefs up the entire Green Lantern landscape. So of course, in this instance, what we knew is that the spirit of Volthoom had basically lived on, where originally we thought he had been killed during the whole Wrath of the First Lantern story and all that kind of stuff. His essence continued to live on because he's effectively immortal. He's the living embodiment of the emotional spectrum. And so as long as the emotional spectrum exists, he'll exist. There's no real surefire way to actually kill him. The issue with this is that during the previous story arcs, Volthoom had basically taken over the body of Rami, but nobody knew what was going on. Now again, with regards to everybody watching these events unfold, to their eyes, Rami is one of the original Guardians of the Universe. And so the idea is that since he was the one that basically created the original Green Lantern rings, the idea is to bring him back in and to see why some of these rings are malfunctioning. Now, of course, this is really kind of a background plot to what's going on for the first half of this story. For the first half, it's really just training, and it's actually pretty cool because what ends up happening here is Kyle Rayner and Guy Gardner are invoked. And the reason why is because of the fact that if you go through and you look at the different lanterns that exist out there, Guy Gardner, Hal Jordan, Kyle Rayner, John Stewart, the Earth-based Green Lanterns, for the most part, John Stewart, Guy Gardner, and Kyle Rayner are basically just different facets of Hal Jordan's personality. They represent the kind of things that make him who he is. In the case of John Stewart, he is tactical, he's meticulous. At the same time, Kyle Rayner can be a little bit reckless, and he can also be the funny guy. And when it comes down to it, Guy Gardner will do whatever it takes to win. And so because of those things, Guy Gardner's really like the powerhouse of the Green Lantern Corps. He's the fighter. He's the guy that you want in your corner whenever things go to pot. And so in this instance, his training with Jessica Cruz is intense. And the basis behind this training is what happens if you're in a situation where you don't have your lantern ring, or what happens if you're in a situation where you're facing somebody who's just as capable of using their ring as you are. It's not just about being able to conjure constructs, it's about being able to work in your surroundings. And that's the lesson that's being taught to Jessica Cruz. At the same time, with Simon Baz, he's very, look, I can just go in and I can punch and everything will be okay. But Kyle Rayner is not that way. Kyle Rayner's success in the 1990s, the reason why his role as the Green Lantern was so popular among fans is because artists and writers began crafting Kyle Rayner in a way where he would use these far more complex and intricate constructs. He'd make these giant anime, mecha devices, whatever it is that people call them. He'd create these super elaborate, complex constructs because he was an artist. And so he would pour his artist skills into his lantern constructs. And so what ends up happening here is he's basically making the point to Simon Baz, it's not enough to just come running in, guns blazing. Sometimes you have to be smart. You have to understand that there's no way for you to simply overcome a foe or a number of foes through sheer strength alone. Sometimes you have to outthink them. And so again, it's creating this idea that Green Lanterns have to be broad. They have to be very well-rounded in terms of how they use their skills. Because as Sinestro Corps War taught a lot of the Green Lanterns, at any point in time, they could find themselves surrounded by a litany of foes that they can't all defeat at the same time. And so they have to be fast on their feet. They have to be fast in terms of how they react. They have to be able to counter every step of the way while keeping themselves alive and protecting those around them. Now again, transitioning into the second part of this story, this focuses a lot on the travel lantern. Now again, the travel lantern is something that we fleshed out over the course of our discussions on Green Lantern Rebirth, but for all the folks who are new here, the chronology of Volthoom basically went like this. Originally, when he was created by Jeff Johns, he was just there one day, and he was just the guy who taught the Guardians of the Universe how to tap into the emotional spectrum. The idea is that with Volthoom, he basically had his original ring. The problem is that his original ring allowed him to mainline the entirety of the emotional spectrum, and with absolute power comes absolute corruption. Well, really, it's absolute power corrupts absolutely, but the idea here was that Volthoom just kind of went mad with power. That was the original story. Now, that original story has remained intact to a degree. The difference is that a backup story was added to it, which basically told us that Volthoom hailed from a different universe, and Volthoom sought to basically keep his universe alive by jumping to different realities and finding those with the power to travel back to his home universe and save it. The problem with this is that when Volthoom traveled to these different universes, again, he ended up on Earth 3. Some magician basically took a piece of his essence, threw it in the power ring, but everywhere he went, he ended up finding people who just didn't have the power to help him achieve his goal until he showed up in the main DC universe and encountered the Guardians of the Universe. The result is that they allowed him to begin teaching them to tap into the emotional spectrum. The result was that they started going through all these different things, trying to figure out which part of the emotional spectrum was the most balanced, ultimately settling on Will in the form of the Green Lantern Corps, which eventually led to Volthoom basically being the first Lantern and so on and so forth. And then his history kind of continues as it did when he was originally introduced by Jeff Johns. So because of all this, the idea here is that with Volthoom operating inside the body of Rami is basically this goal where he has been brought in by the Guardians of the Universe to figure out why some of these rings are malfunctioning. But his goal is to find out what happened to the travel lantern, with him basically taking over the body of Rami and trying to figure out what's going on, or at least what happened to the travel lantern. In the end, his only goal is to go home. That's it. It's not super complicated. Now, of course, going through and trying to find the travel lantern, he ultimately ends up figuring out that while the travel lantern has kind of been, repurposed to basically form the 7 original Green Lantern rings, that he simply can't locate where these original Green Lantern rings are at. There's really no information there except for one. And the person who has one of those original Green Lantern rings is Jessica Cruz. Now, this is one of those cool moments where we talk about how something small happens at some point and then it turns out to be significant. That's the way the Green Lantern's always been done. It's always been a writer coming along and saying, hey, here's this little thing here. And then that's it. You never hear hide nor hair of it until you get around to like 6 months later. And then suddenly it's a huge point of the story. And in this instance, when Jessica Cruz originally received the Earth 3 power ring, Volthoom would just talk to her, constantly taunt her, keep her in a state of fear, keep her under control, that kind of a thing. When Darkseid War happened at the end of New 52 and it led into DC Rebirth, when she became a Green Lantern, she got an actual Green Lantern ring. And to those of us who are readers, we were just like, okay, cool, a Green Lantern ring, no muss, no fuss. What this story tells us is she got one of the lantern rings that belonged to one of the original 7 lanterns. The reason why that matters is because her ring is the key that can be used to access the travel lantern and allow Volthoom to go home. And so that's why this stuff is so cool. Now, of course, with Jessica Cruz and Simon Baz basically finishing their training, what ends up happening is they're basically brought to a place called the Vault of Shadows. Now, this is cool because this is one of those instances where we basically learn that, again, the Guardians of the Universe have all kinds of secrets. While the Guardians of the Universe consider themselves protectors of the universe, while they were the creators of the Green Lantern Corps, essentially a humanitarian peacekeeping force with the power to kill those who were extremely dangerous, the Guardians of the Universe operate under the mantra of the Green Lanterns and the universe will learn what they need to know if and when they need to know it. Ultimately, what ends up happening here is that in this moment, Jessica Cruz and Simon Baz are brought to this vault, basically this Vault of Shadows, and the goal is to basically use the ring of Jessica Cruz to access the travel lantern and then just return back to his own universe. In the midst of all this, they're basically met with the arrival of Tyranner. Now, the cool thing about his character is he's appeared before. Actually, he appeared in Green Lantern's Rebirth, issue number 18, which was, again, some of the stories that we saw earlier. But it's the idea that he knows who Jessica Cruz and Simon Baz are. The crazy thing about this is that, remember, as one of the original Lanterns and as a person with his own set of abilities, he can see through hallucinations. He can see through things as they really are, as opposed to how people would like them to be. The reason why this is important is because he immediately picks up on the fact that this is not Rami, that this is Rami possessed possessed by the spirit of Volthoom. And so immediately he tries to go out and attack. Now remember, Simon Baz and Jessica Cruz don't know about this. They have no idea. And it's very easy for Volthoom to kind of pawn this off and say, well, the guy's been living in isolation forever. He's just a crazy dude. We'll just keep him here in stasis, and then we'll go out and we'll investigate, and we'll try to see if we can do what it was we were here to achieve. What he was here to find was the first lantern ring. Now, one of the things that I want you guys to notice is how this lantern ring operates, how it conducts itself. The first lantern ring is part and parcel to Volthoom himself. It's basically a ring tagged directly to him. And so because of this, there's a huge difference between the first lantern ring and the phantom ring. In truth, in a lot of ways, they are very, very similar. The phantom ring was created by Rami as this ring that anybody could pick up. It didn't require you to be able to overcome great fear and instill fear in others. Instead, you could just walk into anywhere, pick it up, and use it. And you were able to basically channel the different abilities of the emotional spectrum. The difference here is that, as far as I'm aware, the phantom ring did not allow a person to use all the powers of the emotional spectrum at the same time. The Ring of Volthoom does. The actual first lantern ring literally just mainlines the entirety of the emotional spectrum into Volthoom. And this is kind of a cool moment because we would expect him to basically lose his mind and just go back to being a bad guy again, but not necessarily. An argument could be made here that when he was first endowed with all this power, it was more than he could handle. It's giving a 16-year-old a key to a Lamborghini. Of course they're gonna crash it. But if you give that key to a 45-year-old man, he'll be wiser, he'll be more experienced, he'll be able to handle that kind of a car much, much better. I wish I had that kind of a car. But the idea is that with Volthoom, he's grown wiser over the years. He knows what his goal is. He's able to control this power. And so the result is that with Simon Baz and Jessica Cruz being fully fledged lanterns, they are no consequence to Volthoom, not in the slightest. And so in this instance, his goal is to simply snatch the ring of Jessica Cruz. Now, of course, Simon Baz is incapacitated in this instance, and Jessica Cruz is able to overcome her fear and try to face off against Volthoom. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because where he keeps saying travel lantern take off, the travel lantern recognizes the voice of Volthoom whisking away, but not with Volthoom. Instead, it whisks away with Simon Baz and Jessica Cruz. And so these two characters, while Volthoom is still left in the main DC universe, these two characters are simply shot out into the multiverse, knocked out to Earth 15, sent over to the reality that Volthoom hails from. So this is going to be kind of a cool moment, because the indication here is that we'll actually see what his universe looks like now. It's a pretty cool scenario. It's a pretty cool situation. But anyway, guys, again, one of my favorite stories coming out of DC right now when it comes to the Green Lanterns. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.